Series of stories based on the novel Mayor of Casterbridge by Thomas Hardy. Man of Character, episodes 2, 3, and...
The morning sun was streaming through the crevices of the canvas when the man awoke. A warm glow pervaded the whole atmosphere of the marquee, and a single big blue fly buzzed musically round and round in it.
Besides, at the table supported by trestles, at his basket of tools, at the stove where the furmity had been boiled, at the empty basins, at some shed grains of wheat, at the crocks which dotted the grassy floor.
Among the odds and ends he discerned a little shining object and picked it up. It was his wife's ring.
A confused picture of the events of the previous evening seemed to come back to him, and he thrust his hand into his breast pocket. A rustling revealed the sailor's banknotes thrust carelessly in.
This second verification of his dim memories was enough. He knew now they were not dreams. He remained seated, looking on the ground for some time.
"I must get out of this as soon as I can," he said deliberately at last, with the air of one who could not catch his thoughts without pronouncing them. "She's gone, to be sure she is. Gone with that sailor who bought her, and little Elizabeth Jane.
We walked here, and I had the furmity, and rum in it, and sold her. Yes, that's what's happened, and here am I. Now, what am I to do? Am I sober enough to walk, I wonder?"
He stood up, found that he was in fairly good condition for progress, unencumbered. Next, he shouldered his tool basket and found he could carry it. Then, lifting the tent door, he emerged into the open air. Here the man looked around with gloomy curiosity. The freshness of the September morning inspired and braced him as he stood. He and his family had been weary when they arrived the night before, and they had observed but little of the place, so that he now behind it as a new thing.
It exhibited itself as the top of an open down, bounded on one extreme by a plantation and approached by a winding road. At the bottom stood the village which lent its name to the upland, and the annual fair that was held thereon.
The spot stretched downward into valleys, and onward to other uplands, dotted with barrows, and trenched with the remains of prehistoric forts. The whole scene lay under the rays of a newly risen sun, which had not as yet dried a single blade of the heavily dewed grass, whereon the shadows of the yellow and red vans were projected far away, those thrown by the felloe of each wheel being elongated in shape to the orbit of a comet. All the gypsies and showmen who had remained on the ground lay snug within their carts and tents, or wrapped in horsecloths under them, and were silent and still as death, with the exception of an occasional snore that revealed their presence. But the 7 sleepers had a dog, and dogs of the mysterious breeds that vagrants own, that are as much like cats as dogs, and as much like foxes as cats, also lay about here. A little one started up under one of the cats, barked as a matter of principle, and quickly lay down again. He was the only positive spectator of the hay-trusser's exit from the Weydon Fairfield. This seemed to accord with his desire. He went on in silent thought, and heeding the yellow hammers which flitted about the hedges with straws in their bills, the crowns of the mushrooms, and the tinkling of local sheep bells, whose wearers had the good fortune not to be included in the fair. When he reached a lane, a good mile from the scene of the previous evening, the man pitched his basket and leant upon a gate. A difficult problem or two occupied his mind.
"Did I tell my name to anybody last night, or didn't I tell my name?" he said to himself, and at last concluded that he did not.
His general demeanor was enough to show how he was surprised and nettled that his wife had taken him so literally. As much could be seen in his face, and in the way he nibbled a straw which he pulled from the hedge.
He knew that she must have been somewhat excited to do this. Moreover, she must have believed that 3 was some sort of binding force in the transaction. On this latter point, he felt almost certain, knowing her freedom from levity of character and the extreme simplicity of her intellect.
There may, too, have been enough recklessness and resentment beneath her ordinary placidity to make her stifle any momentary doubts. On a previous occasion, when he had declared during a fuddle that he would dispose of her as he had done, she had replied that she would not hear him say that many times more before it happened, in the resigned tones of a fatalist.
"Yet she knows I am not in my senses when I do that," he exclaimed. "Well, I must walk about till I find her, seize her. Why didn't she know better than bring me into this disgrace?" he roared out.
She wasn't queer if I was. 'Tis like Susan to show such idiotic simplicity. Meek, that meekness has done me more harm than the bitterest temper.
When he was calmer, he turned to his original conviction that he must somehow find her and his little Elizabeth Jane, and put up with the shame as best he could. It was of his own making, and he ought to bear it.
But first he resolved to register an oath, a greater oath than he had ever sworn before, and to do it properly he required a fit place and imagery, for there was something fetishistic in this man's beliefs.
He shouldered his basket and moved on, casting his eyes inquisitively round upon the landscape as he walked, and at the distance of 3 or 4 miles perceived the roofs of a village and the tower of a church. He instantly made towards the latter object. The village was quite still, it being that motionless hour of rustic daily life which fills the interval between the departure of the field laborers to their work and the rising of their wives and daughters to prepare the breakfast for their return. Hence he reached the church without observation, and the door being only latched, he entered. The hay-trusser deposited his basket by the font, went up the nave till he reached the altar rails, and opening the gate entered the sacrarium, where he seemed to feel a sense of the strangeness for a moment. Then he knelt upon the footpace. Dropping his head upon the clamped book which lay the communion table, he said aloud, "I, Michael Henchard, on this morning of the 16th of September, do take an oath before God here in this solemn place that
I will avoid all strong liquors for the space of 21 years to come, being a year for every year that I have lived, and this I swear upon the book before me, and may I be struck dumb, blind, and helpless if I break this my oath." When he had said it and kissed the big book, the hay-trusser arose and seemed relieved at having made a start in a new direction. While standing in the porch a moment, he saw a thick jet of wood smoke suddenly start up from the red chimney of a cottage near, and knew that the occupant had just lit her fire.
He went round to the door, and the housewife agreed to prepare him some breakfast for a trifling payment, which was done. Then he started on the search for his wife and child.
The perplexing nature of the undertaking became apparent soon enough. Though he exclaimed and inquired, and walked hither and thither day after day, no such characters as those he described had anywhere been seen since the evening of the fair. To add to the difficulty, he could gain no sound of the sailor's name. As money was short with him, he decided, after some hesitation, to spend the sailor's money in the prosecution of this search. But it was equally in vain.
The truth was that a certain shyness of revealing his conduct prevented Michael Henchard from following up the investigation with the loud hue and cry such a pursuit demanded to render it effectual.
And it was probably for this reason that he obtained no clue, though everything was done by him that did not involve an explanation of the circumstances under which he had lost her.
Weeks counted up to months, and still he searched on, maintaining himself by small jobs of work in the intervals. By this time he had arrived at a seaport, and there he derived intelligence that persons answering somewhat to his description had emigrated a little time before.
Then he said he would search no longer, and that he would go and settle in the district which he had for some time in his mind. Next day he started, journeying southwestward, and did not pause, except for night's lodgings, till he reached the town of Casterbridge, in a far distant part of Wessex.
Part 3.
The high road into the village of Weldon Priors was again carpeted with dust. The trees had put on as of yore their aspect of dingy green, and where the Henchard family of 3 had once walked along, 2 persons not unconnected with that family walked now. The scene in its broad aspect had so much of its previous character, even to the voices and rattle from the neighboring village down, that it might, for that matter, have been the afternoon following the previously recorded episode. Change was only to be observed in details, but here it was obvious that a long procession of years had passed by. On of the 2 who walked the road was she who had figured as the young wife of Henchard on the previous occasion. Now her face had lost much of its rotundity. Her skin had undergone a textural change, and though her hair had not lost color, it was considerably thinner than heretofore. She was dressed in the mourning clothes of a widow.
Her companion, also in black, appeared as a well-formed young woman about 18, completely possessed of that ephemeral precious essence youth, which is itself beauty, irrespective of complexion or contour.
A glance was sufficient to inform the eye that this was Susan Henchard's grown-up daughter. While life's middle summer had set its hardening mark on the mother's face,
Her former spring-like specialities were transferred so dexterously by time to the second figure, her child, that the absence of certain facts within her mother's knowledge from the girl's mind would have seemed, for the moment,
to one reflecting on those facts, to be a curious imperfection in nature's powers of continuity.
They walked with joined hands, and it could be perceived in her outer hand a withy basket of old-fashioned make, the mother a blue bundle, which contrasted oddly with her black stuff gown.
reaching the outskirts of the village, they pursued the same track as formerly, and ascended to the fair. Here, too, it was evident that the years had told.
Certain mechanical improvements might have been noticed in the roundabouts and high flyers, machine for testing rustic strength and weight, and in the erections devoted to shooting for nuts. But the real business of the fair had considerably dwindled. The new periodical great markets of neighboring towns were beginning to interfere seriously with the trade carried on here for centuries. The pens for the tie ropes for horses were about half as long as they had been. The stalls of tailors, hosiers, coopers, linen drapers, and other such trades had almost disappeared, and the vehicles were far less numerous. The mother and daughter threaded the crowd for some little distance, and then stood still.
Why did we hinder our time by coming in here? I thought you wished to get onward, said the maiden. Yes, my dear Elizabeth Jane, explained the other, but I had a fancy for looking up here. Why? It was here I first met with Newson on such a day as this.
First met with father here? Yes, you have told me so before, and now he's drowned and gone from us. As she spoke, the girl drew a card from her pocket and looked at it with a sigh. It was edged with black, and inscribed within a design resembling a mural tablet were the words,
In affectionate memory of Richard Newson, mariner, who was unfortunately lost at sea in the month of November, aged 41 years. And it was here, continued her mother, with more hesitation, that I last saw the relation we are going to look for, Mr. Michael Henchard.
What is his exact kin to us, mother? I have never clearly had it told me. He is, or was, for he may be dead, a connection by marriage, said her mother deliberately. That's exactly what you have said a score of times before, replied the young woman, looking about her attentively. He's not a near relation, I suppose? Not by any means. He was a hay trusser, wasn't he, when you last heard of him? He was. I suppose he never knew me? The girl innocently continued. Mrs. Henchard paused for a moment and answered uneasily, Of course not, Elizabeth Jane, but come this way. She moved on to another part of the field. It is not much use inquiring here for anybody, I should think, the daughter observed as she gazed round about. People at fairs change like the leaves of trees, and I dare say you are the only one here to-day who was here all those years ago. I'm not so sure of that, said Mrs. Newson, as she now called herself, keenly eyeing something under a green bank a little off. See there.
The daughter looked in the direction signified. The object pointed out was a tripod of sticks into the earth, from which hung a three-legged crock, kept hot by a smouldering wood fire beneath. Over the pot stooped an old woman, haggard, wrinkled, and almost in rags.
She stirred the contents of the pot with a large spoon, and occasionally croaked in a broken voice. Good furmity sold here.
It was indeed the former mistress of the furmity tent, once thriving, cleanly, white, aproned, and chinking with money, now tentless, dirty, owning no tables or benches, and having scarce any customers except two small whitey-brown boys who came up and asked for
a hop orth, please, good measure, which she served in a couple of chipped yellow basins of commonest clay. She was here at the time, resumed Mrs. Newson, making a step as if to draw nearer. Don't speak to her, it isn't respectable, urged the other. I will just say a word. You, Elizabeth Jane, can stay here.
The girl was not loth, and turned to some stalls of colored prints, while her mother went forward. The old woman begged for the latter's custom as soon as she saw her, and responded to Mrs. Henchard Newson's request for a pennyworth with more alacrity than she had shown in selling sixpennyworth in her younger days.
When the widow had taken the basin of thin, poor slop that stood for the rich concoction of the former time, the hug opened a little basket behind the fire, and looking up slyly whispered, Just a thought of rum in it. Smuggled, you know. Say 2 pennorth. 'Twill make it slip down like cordial.
Her customer smiled bitterly at this survival of the old trick, and shook her head with a meaning the old woman was far from translating. She pretended to eat a little of the furmity with the leaden spoon offered, and as she did so, said blandly to the hag, You've seen better days? Ah, ma'am, well ye may say it, responded the old woman, opening the sluices of her heart forthwith. I've stood in this fair ground mind, wife and widow, these 39 year, and in that time have known what it was to do business with the richest stomachs in the land. Ma'am, you'd hardly believe that. I was once the owner of a great pavilion tent that was the attraction of the fair. Nobody could come, nobody could go, without having a dish of Mrs. Goodenough's furmity.
I knew the clergy's taste, the dandy gent's taste. I knew the town's taste, the country's taste. I even knowed the test of the coarse, shameless females. But Lord's my life, the world's no memory. Straightforward dealings don't bring profit. 'Tis the sly and the underhand that get on in these times.
Mrs. Newson glanced round. Her daughter was still bending over the distant stalls. "Can you call to mind," she said cautiously to the old woman, "the sale of a wife by her husband in your tent 18 years ago today?"
The hag reflected, and half shook her head. "If it had been a big thing, I should have minded it in a moment," she said. "I can mind every serious fight o' married parties, every murder, every manslaughter, even every pocket-picking, leastwise large one, that it has been my lot to witness. But a selling, was it done quiet-like? Well, yes, I think so."
The furmity woman half shook her head again. "And yet," she said, "I do. At any rate, I can mind a man doing something o' the sort. A man in a cord jacket with a basket of tools. But Lord bless ye, we don't give it head-room. We don't such as that."
"The only reason why I can mind the man is that he came back here to the next year's fair, and told me quite private-like that if a woman ever asked for him, I was to say he had gone to, where? Casterbridge. Yes, to Casterbridge, said he. But Lord's my life, I shouldn't have thought of it again."
Mrs. Newson would have rewarded the old woman as far as her small means afforded, had she not discreetly borne in mind that it was by that unscrupulous person's liquor her husband had been degraded.
She briefly thanked her informant, and rejoined Elizabeth, who greeted her with, "Mother, do let's go on. It was hardly respectable for you to buy refreshments there. I see none but the lowest do."
I have learnt what I wanted, however, said her mother quietly. The last time our relative visited this fair, he said he was living at Casterbridge.
"It is a long, long way from here, and it was many years ago that he said it, but there I think we'll go." With this they descended out of the fair, and went on ward to the village, where they obtained a night's lodging.
Next part coming soon.